So we're now recording. And just a second, I'm putting the live on Facebook. And that requires a little technical step. And hopefully it will work. Okay, so I think we're good to go. Tell me if there's an echo once it starts, because it's got a page for Facebook, so I might need to mute something or do something if there's an echo. So I'm turning it over to you, Larry, and welcome everybody.
Awesome. Well, Nick, it is such an honor and a pleasure to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. As Nick mentioned, you know, he and I have known each other many, many years. We go back to the early 90s. We were both training for Anchor Point Institute in Salt Lake City, Utah. Was an NLP institute there at the time. Many of you probably familiar with it. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about meeting Nick and training with Nick and training from Nick is your language mastery. I was always so impressed with how precise and how clever and artistic your language skills were, and it was something that I really wanted to model. And of course, we have a common background in neurolinguistic programming and hypnotherapy and many other change work modalities. And so anyway, we became fast friends over the years and have enjoyed these creative collaboration webversations, as we like to call them, over the years. So Nick, if you would, tell us a little bit more about your background and how did you come to be the transformational poet?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I first, when I was in high school, my English teacher in high school was kind of like my model and mentor. He was an amazing guy. He lived a very unique life for that time period, and I befriended him. He befriended me. He was very much into the humanities and into C.G. Jung in the psychology field, and so he introduced me to C.G. Jung. And at the time, I became very fascinated with the idea of archetypes and with the idea that we could have these resources inside of us, this kind of configurations inside of us that could actually be guiding us in life in some way. And so I've always had this sense of a presence that, like an angelic presence that's guided me along the way in life. And I think as I became familiar with the archetypal psychology world and interested in psychology for a variety of reasons, one of the main things that I was interested in was how we could relate to our own otherness, so to speak, to that world inside of us where you could say things that we don't think come and behaviors that we don't sometimes choose to do occur. You know, that other part of us that we have to learn to navigate life with. You know, we do these things we sometimes don't want to do, or we want to do something, we don't do it, and we have those struggles with ourselves. And then there are those times when we have this amazing sense of flow in life. And so for me, I've always been curious about how can we relate to this otherness inside of us. And that became actually kind of a background theme in throughout my life. In the mid-70s, I was working at a crisis center, working with people who were considering suicide. So they would call in, and my job was to talk them through that situation. And there were questions about death and dying on the wall. So I took them home and answered them in my journal. But I wasn't happy with the answers. I wasn't satisfied. And then one night at the crisis center, we lost somebody. And literally, the phone was still on when the crew got there to try to save him, and they couldn't. And I could hear them saying, you know, he's gone. And then after that, they hung up the phone. So the guy died while I was on the phone, you know, trying to help him at the time. Anyway, so I went home that night being frustrated with all my answers. And I got this image of sitting across from death, playing a game of chess with death. And I was frustrated with the game, so I knocked the pieces off. And then started this conversation with death, which death asked me questions like, where are you? And I realized I'm sitting on a grave. And he goes, whose grave is it? I realized it was my own grave. And what place was it? It was in a graveyard. And where was the graveyard? I didn't know. And so in this inner dialogue, death gave me the assignment to go find out where the land or country is, where my grave is, and who rules that land. And so I went off on this adventure. And for me, that was the first time, that was like probably in my early 20s, first time I had this incredible sense of this inner landscape, this undiscovered country that's inside of us. And since that actually turned into a whole work of fiction. I have 3 books of fiction that are based on this conversation with death that begin to explore the imaginal landscape around that place where my graveyard is in my mind. And each of the directions around there has different stories associated with them. So I have this very, very powerful sense of a country inside that you can actually explore. And for me, over the years, having developed my career in psychology and hypnotherapy, exploring the unconscious with people, this idea has become more and more palpable to me, that there is a place inside of us that is like an undiscovered country for us to explore. So for me, I think living well means learning to walk the landscape of the soul with greater elegance. And really, that's what my poetry is all about. And that's why I call myself the Transformational Poet, because it's really about how do you walk the landscape of your soul? How do you encounter life in a way that allows you to bring your heart and your soul and your spirit there more completely or more fully? How do you interact with the world, letting it change you, and through the changing of you, emerge and blossom into your fullness? So for me, that's really what the book is about, and what my life, I think, is about, is helping people to do that.
That's wonderful. As I've gotten to be a great fan of your work, this is your 8th book, is that correct?
It's actually the 9th book of poetry.
The 9th book.
I thought it was my 8th until I counted them. So I've been saying it's the 8th, and then I counted, oh, wait a minute, this is the 9th one.
Yeah. So I was super excited. I've purchased and I've read almost all of your books. I'm about 60% through the Undiscovered Country, and I'm really enjoying it because it's got a really unique structure. It's not only a collection of poetry and prose, but it's also a workbook where you can, there's philosophical questions, there's tasks, there's writing prompts, and it's really, I think, very well structured. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book itself, what inspired it? I mean, you told us a little bit already, but also more about the archetypal journey, and how is it like a map that we can actually use to navigate?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, the map came about when I was challenged one night in China. I teach regular hypnotherapy class in China, very structured hypnotherapy class, training people to learn how to be hypnotherapists. It starts with very basic skills and builds up to more and more powerful skills, very practical oriented class. And went to teach it after teaching there for about 15 years. I went to teach one night, and I was talking with my sponsor, and he kind of challenged me to revamp the class at that time. And class was going great. Everybody loved it, but we've been doing the same thing for a long time. So there was a little bit of a challenge. And being a person who takes those kinds of challenges seriously, that night, I literally revamped the whole class and stepped in the next day, starting first segment, the first 6 days of a 12-day class with a completely new content surprise to everybody. What happened that night is I began thinking about, if I were to revamp this class, what would be the premise for it? And in that struggle, to try to figure that out, I had this insight came to me that I could organize the class around this grid that's based on 2 axes, 2 intersecting axes. One of them is the outer world and the inner world, and the known and the unknown. And then that creates 4 quadrants. In fact, I'll show it to you. I'll do a little screen share of that map of the archetypal journey here. So can you see that?
Yes.
So I came up with this. There's the outer world and the inner world, and then there's the known or conscious and the unknown or conscious. And so that creates 4 quadrants. So one of those is the known outer world. Each quadrant has a philosophical question and a poetic question. So the philosophical question, it's not here on this chart, but the philosophical question for this known outer world is what's important or what matters. So it's about getting clear, having discernment. And each quadrant also has a poetic question. The poetic question here is your horizon big enough to hold your dreams? So when it comes to interacting with the outer world, we have our idea of the outer world. You could say our horizon of beliefs. And if our horizon of beliefs is too limiting, it won't matter how big our dreams are because we won't be able to crest that horizon. We won't be able to go beyond that point. So the work in that area is really about clarifying sort of what's important to you, and then you could say working through the limiting beliefs that prevent you from living a full, rich life. And then there's the known inner world. And the philosophical question there is, who are you? And the poetic question is your embrace of your own life wide enough for you to be yourself? In other words, many of us, we disown parts of ourselves for good reasons sometimes. Maybe, they weren't acceptable to our parents or to our culture or to our world, and, we got shamed about them. Or maybe we're actually really good at something, or we have some talent, but we don't want to overshadow other people. So we tend to hold ourselves back. And oftentimes we hold ourselves back or disown parts of ourselves. And therefore, because of that, we don't have access to the full range of expression. And then there's the unknown inner world, which is the philosophical question, where do you come from, or what's your source? And the poetic question is your taproot of trust in life deep enough to support your growth? So for instance, many of us are kind of limited because we don't trust ourselves or our life to take care of us. We might have that set of fears or concerns or worries that prevent us from going forward. And even though we have them, if we had a deep trust in life, we might still be able to go forward. So this is about our ability to have that kind of trust that the universe is a friendly place, or the universe will support us in some way. And then there's the unknown outer world, which is the philosophical question, why are you here? And the poetic question is, how far can you extend the reach of your heart into the world? So for me, this is not just about mission and vision. This is about walking a path with heart. And I call this an archetypal journey because I believe these are perennial questions, meaning these are questions we return to at different points in our life and wrestle with at different points in our life, and in the process of moving forward and becoming a fuller, richer expression of ourselves. And so that's kind of how this map came about. And I think of it as a map because when I'm in a struggle, I can go there and begin to identify, well, what's the core part of that? What's the core question this is really addressing? Is this about deepening my trust in life, or my roots, the parts that support me? Or is this about broadening my horizon so that I can do more and have more possible? Is this about what I bring to the world, how much of my heart I bring to the world? So for me, it gives me a place, a point of entry, so to speak, for knowing what the issue is. And when I'm working with clients in a coaching context, it also gives me a point of entry for working with clients as well. Like, what's the primary question they're struggling with? And I found that oftentimes the way we answer that question is by working in the other areas. We often need to work in one of the other areas or a couple of the other areas to get the support to move forward in that area. So it's a map in that sense. It's not a map like a city map or a topographical map. It's more a map of the kind of, you could say, again, the perennial questions and issues that I think a soulful person faces on the journey through life. So did that answer the question, or did I go off somewhere else?
No, it certainly worked for me. Yeah, so it's I think it's an extremely useful frame or map, a map of the territory. And in this 4-part series, I as we talked before, to focus on each of the 4 parts of this map. So today we're kind of focusing on the known inner world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if you would like to share maybe a piece from the book around that, and tell us more about this known inner world.
Yeah, so the known inner world would be the world within us that we're aware of, and how we can expand that awareness so it includes more of who we are and more of our capacities to be effective in the world. And the resource associated with that is love or acceptance. So for me, that's why the question is your embrace of your own life wide enough for you to be yourself, or for you to bring your best to the planet, so to speak? Each of the quadrants is based on a theme, so that theme of widening the embrace applies to that area. And then what I included is tasks with each of those areas. So there are 3 tasks. And I'm going to go into the tasks in a minute, but first what I want to do is share a poem. So the book is both a book of poetry and a workbook, a poem that I actually published in another book, but it's really, for me, one of the best expressions of the struggle in knowing ourselves. And the poem is called Awakening. So I'm going to pull it up. I don't unfortunately have it memorized, so let me go get it from my book. It'll take me a second to get there. So Awakenings. The poem is called Awakenings, and I actually it was in a book that I published called Divine Whispering, which I originally was actually going to title Awakening. So I had this whole set of collections in this book. The poem Awakening, in my mind, was really the theme of that book at the time. And I was going to publish it in that name, but I looked up other books titled Awakening, and there are just many of them. There are lots of books out there titled Awakening. So I decided that wasn't really a good title to use, and I retitled the book Divine Whispering. So here's the poem Awakening. The real awakening is not an awakening to your day, but an awakening to your life. It occurs with the gradual casting of light on the glorious mess of your life. When you realize no matter how brightly you shine, you will still cast a shadow. When you know no matter how carefully you tread, you will still leave dirty footprints in the lives of others. When you recognize the only way forward is to walk with your head held high, even though you will likely fall short of the mark, and you may never quite fulfill your promise. You awaken when you know the next step you take will land you right in the middle of that glorious mess that you call your life. And you take the step anyway, unconditionally, wholeheartedly, because there is nowhere else you would rather land than in your own life. The real awakening is not an awakening to your day, but an awakening to your life. It occurs with the gradual casting of light on that glorious mess of your life. When you realize no matter how brightly you shine, you will still cast a shadow. When you know no matter how carefully you tread, you will still leave dirty footprints in the lives of others. When you recognize the only way forward is to walk with your head held high, even though you will likely fall short of the mark, and you may never quite fulfill your promise. You awaken when you know the next step you take will land you right in the middle of that glorious mess that you call your life. And you take the step anyway, unconditionally, wholeheartedly, because there is nowhere else you would rather land than in your own life. I really think that's, to me, the essence of our relationship with ourselves. It's like recognizing that, we can do our best, we can try our best, we're still going to mess things up. We're still going to screw up. We're still going to do things, whether we do them intentionally or unintentionally, that are going to hurt people. People are going to hurt us. It's the way life is. But if we can open our arms to that and let that be a part of this amazing journey that we have from birth to death, then we're much more likely to be able to bring our best to the world. So that's really the theme of that section of the book, is that ability to sort of embrace the, quote, the messiness of our lives, and to bring that with us as we go forward, and make it actually a resource for us. And you know, I mentioned earlier, there are like 3 tasks. And so the 3 tasks for this area are dancing with shadow. So in the Jungian archetypal system, the shadow are those parts of ourselves that we disown. And a lot of times that's assumed to be the negative parts, the things we might be ashamed of or that we might hide. But in my mind, it also includes sometimes our grace and our dignity and our strengths that we might have had to hold back because we didn't want to outshine other people, or maybe we were afraid we'd be perceived in a certain way. So it's both sides of that equation. So dancing with shadows, that's one task. Second task is living the full catastrophe. How many of you are familiar with Zorba the Greek? Great movie with Anthony Quinn, based on the book by Nikos Katsantzis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but a great book. There's a scene in the movie where Zorba is asked by somebody, "Are you married?" And Zorba's response is something like, you know, "Am I not a man? Am I not stupid?" He says, "I have children, I have wife, I have children, I have the whole catastrophe." And John Kabat-Zinn, who's a meditation psychologist and meditation guide, took that line, living the full catastrophe, and uses it in his meditation classes as a way of expressing how, you know, we live life fully, and of course it's going to be messy, like in the poem, but to live the full catastrophe of it. And so it's like, how do we live our life fully, you know, given all the things that go with it? So that's the idea behind that one. And then the third task in that section is welcoming the hero home. So those are the 3 tasks: dancing with shadows, living the full catastrophe, and welcoming the hero home. Each section has poems, and then each of the poems has questions and writing prompts to go with them.
That's awesome, Nick. One of the things that I really appreciate about your poems in general, and in this book in particular, is that, you know, it touches on some really important or significant aspect of our lives, like in the poem Awakening. How do we embrace our humanity and our divinity? You know, that we have this sort of physical nature, non-physical nature, and how do we harmonize all of that? And that each, in this particular book, that there's, along with the poem, that there is there's tasks, there's questions, there's writing prompts, so that you can work it. Is there anything more you'd want to share about your intent around the workbook side of it? How do we use the workbook along with the poetry to make a difference in our lives?
You know, I'm a lover of questions. And I think sometimes when we're reading something, we could just read it and take it in and then go on with our life. Or you can read something and you can ponder it and you can sort of wonder about it or ask questions about it. You know, they found actually that in research on how people become wise, you know, you don't become wise just as a function of age. What they found from research is that wisdom is the result of reflection. People who are young, who do more reflecting on experience and reflecting on life, are more likely to develop this quality or capacity called wisdom than people who have grown older but didn't reflect as much. So reflection, in my mind, is really it's like the turning point. It's the key that transforms our experience into wisdom. And I think particularly when you take on something like a book or you watch a movie, but you do it for the purpose of learning, that the best way to do that is to bring that inquiring mind to that, to bring an inquiring mind. So what I tried to do in this book was, one was present this idea that there could be a map for journeying life soulfully. So the map of the Archetypal Journey was a way of, a model for sort of organizing how we might deepen our interaction with ourselves and with the world. And poetry, I think, is a particularly powerful way of doing that, because poetry is a condensed language, a metaphoric language, a language of the soul. So it speaks to a deeper level. So I thought as a combination, having poems and then having questions to ponder, if you wish to do it, or writing prompts to write from, serves as your tool to take from the page and transform, in your wrestling with it, so to speak, transform it into something that's yours, something that you can use, something that you can take away from and live your life. To me, there would be no greater blessing than if people take the work that I do and use it in some way that it shifts or changes or transforms their life or their experience of life, even if it's in a small way, that can help them to navigate life with greater grace and dignity. That's, to me, the greatest, I think, the greatest honoring of any author, especially authors or people out in the world who are trying to do change work, is that people who receive them actually do something with that in their life. And I think also, in a strange way, all my writing is for myself. And so these are sometimes, like, I write these, and then I'll go back and read them later on, and I'll actually have a completely different experience. So there's a poem, actually, it's in this section in this part of the book that's on dancing with shadows. It's called Lean Close. And I want to read that poem to you, Lean Close. And this poem really, again, when I'm writing, sometimes I don't know what the poem is going to be about. I might just get an opening line. The opening line in this one is, "Where do my whispered secrets go if there is no ear close enough to hear?" Where do my whispered secrets go if there's no ear close enough to hear? And so this idea, this phrase might come, and then I kind of riff from there, and out of it will come a poem that I didn't think in advance that's what I'm going to write about. And this poem, it turned out to be, I think, partly about this struggle that we sometimes have to speak what's in our heart. You know, there's a difficult conversation we have to have with somebody, and we're afraid to have it, and we hold it back. Or maybe there's a truth we need to speak to the world, but we don't have the courage to speak it. And the poem is really about that dance with ourself. You know, that part of us that maybe is afraid of the consequences, or feels shame for holding on to something, or doesn't want to admit or confess something, or doesn't want to bring something up because it's going to rock the boat. You know, that dance with that part of us. So Lean Close is the poem I want to share. Where do my whispered secrets go if there is no ear close enough to hear? I don't want to treat you like the last chance, or pin your hair with hope. And the pebbles in my mouth are not enough to quell the stammering tongue of my heart. So I never told you of my ghostly fear, or spoke of my kinship with the mist. I just held out the rope without explanation, hoping you would guess, after all the years standing in for the opposition, that I want to be tied down. Now there is so little to keep me anchored to the earth, the rope may not be enough. You may need to nail my feet to the floor and then lean close enough for me to whisper my confession. It is not reticence or embarrassment, but the unspeakable holiness of my longing for you that keeps the embers burning even after the heartbreak of desire. You know, I think so many of us, and I know this is true in my life, we move from the heart to the head in order to get through life, in order to navigate the world, in order to use our strategic mind to figure out our way. And a lot of times that journey, we leave behind some part of our heart that actually knows what the next step is much better than our mind could ever figure it out. And I think the challenge with that is that sometimes when we move up there, which I've done very well in my life, we start to lose our grounding on the earth. We literally start to lift up into the lofty places where ideas dance, as I say in another poem. We actually begin to lift up out of our lives, get up above our lives. And we get out of contact with ourselves. You know, in English, there's this idea and it's often used around marriage, you know, and men probably use this about they don't want to be tied down. The idea of being tied down. And yet you could say that also means, are we willing to stand true to our commitments? Are we willing to tie ourselves down to a principle or tie ourselves down to a truth? And I think a poem is both about that holding back that fear of expressing, that fear of making something rock the boat in a relationship possibly, but it's also about our fear of really taking a stand and really committing ourselves. And so the funny thing is, I wrote that poem, you know, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago or something like that, included it in this book. When I was thinking about what I wanted to share, I went back and read this poem, almost like somebody else wrote it, almost like I was analyzing it. And sometimes I'm like surprised what I get from my poems when I look at them from a different perspective like that. And so this is like we're dancing with that shadow inside of us, that part of us that, you know, we've got some truth that we're hiding sometimes from ourselves and certainly from other people. So where do we find, you know, the courage, the strength to embrace that, and then to speak it when we need to speak it?
You know,
So
Nick,
you know, from that, you just kind of close out your question. So after that poem, there's questions to ponder, like one of them is, what ghostly fears do you keep to yourself? So the line in the poem about, I never told you of my ghostly fear, or spoke of my kinship with the mist. You know, what ghostly fears do we keep to ourselves? What things do you like or love? Kinship with the mist that you might be afraid to admit to others. So the poem is an introduction to an idea, and then the questions can give you a chance to think about, well, how does that apply to me, and what might be there inside of me that I could, you know, do my own dance with, so to speak, to get something valuable for yourself out of it. Another question is, what irrepressible longing in you has survived hurt, heartbreak, and betrayal? The poem ends with, you know, the embers burning even despite the heartbreak of desire. You know, we all have heartbreak in life. For me, there's the big heartbreak. So there's heartbreaks that we have when our heart is broken, for, you know, somebody betrays us or a relationship falls apart. And then there's the heartbreak when we feel that our yearning or our longing for something is squelched or killed, the heartbreak of desire. And I think as humans, we all have that. And we still have to go on and find our way back to our passion and reclaim it again. So that's an example of how that works in the book.
You know, one thing I really enjoy about the book, Nick, is this. You know, how do we learn to love and accept ourselves? You know, that there's you talk about there's like two selves. There's the self that's like one side is accepting or loving or judging or criticizing another part, and it's like how do we learn to love ourselves, to accept ourselves? And you talk about that a lot in the book. Do you want to expand on that a little bit more with us?
Yeah, you know, I think this whole section is about, I think the resources for navigating the known inner world are love and acceptance. And, you know, love in terms of finding a way that we can love the landscape, this inner landscape, even though there might be rocky crags and, you know, dangerous areas in it. Because the more we can embrace our own landscape, I think the more we're capable of allowing other people to walk their landscape and embracing them, helping them to bring forth the best in them. And to me, that's really about welcoming the hero home, so to speak. It's like bringing back into ourselves not only those challenging parts of ourselves, but our grace and our dignity and our ability to be gentle and kind in the world. All those qualities and traits that, you know, we might even be hesitant about expressing. So it's about both sides of them. When I was actually about to publish this book and I had picked out some poems for it, I wrote a poem. This was a couple months ago, just before I put the book together, that I wrote this poem called I Met Someone. And it's really about this idea of self-care and self-compassion. Here's how it came about. I was actually pouring myself a cup of water, and I was recalling as I was pouring this a time when I was young, with my first girlfriend, and I believe it was tea at the time. I was pouring her a cup of tea, and I remember that feeling I had in the moment I was pouring the cup of tea for her, feeling this deep affection. And this act was an act of care and love for her. And I remember that feeling so distinctly, like pouring this cup for another person because you care about them or because you want to give them something. The act becomes more than just giving the cup of tea. It's almost like giving your heart to the person. And as I was pouring it and thinking about that moment, I realized I'm actually pouring a cup of water for myself. That this was a kind of a loving act of taking care of myself. And as that came, I was reduced to tears in the moment, actually. And this poem came out of it called I Met Someone. Today, I fell in love with the act of filling my water jug as if it was a caring watershed. And I wanted to put every joy into cutting vegetables because they nourish me. To fold all of my affection into my clothes because they caress me. To infuse endless delight in tidying the house because it wants to indulge me. Now I am delirious, as if I found the lost city of gold after stumbling around in the jungle all my life. If you ask me, what am I doing that makes me so happy? I will tell you, I finally met someone to love. You know, I wanted to put every joy into cutting vegetables because they nourish me. I mean, think about it. When you're cutting or chopping food to prepare for a meal for yourself or for other people, that's a really incredibly caring act. You're doing something so fundamental and so basic. But if you do it with heart and with intention, it transforms that act into something more than just the act of, you know, breaking bread together. It's really about how we care for ourselves and for each other. And this morning, yesterday morning, as I was thinking about this and I was actually doing dishes, and I realized that I have this pattern of, you know, and probably all of you do this pattern of I start doing things and then I get interrupted and I do something else. And eventually I have all these little messes around the house. Or I work on a project. I have a collage. I love to make collage. I'm a collage artist. And I have like my collage midway through and it's got, you know, cut out pictures and paper all over and, you know, places where I do the gluing and all that. And it's a big mess. And as I was doing dishes, I had this thought come to mind that picking up after myself in that way, it's like would you pick up after a baby or pick up after a dog. You know, they make messes, you pick them up. They're acts of taking care of. And I actually made a vow to myself as I was doing the dishes there, thinking about this idea of picking up. I vowed I will pick up after you. That's really a great act of taking care of myself. Go about my days, I do my thing, I make some messes, and I will pick up after myself. And to do that lovingly, to do that as a recognition that I'm doing this simple, basic act, but it is in a deeper way, it is a deep act of profound self-compassion and self-care. To me, I think to get to the point where I can do that consistently, that to me would be to get to the point where I'm truly falling in love with my life.
Beautiful. You know, Nick, one of the things that I came away with from one of your previous books, Bearing Witness, and you touched on it a little bit earlier about that wisdom is a function of reflection, and the whole bearing witness process, but which, by the way, I highly recommend that book as well. But so, Nick, would you be willing to entertain some questions from the lovely folks who have joined us today about your work and the book and so on, while we have a few minutes left?
I'd love to, yeah. We'll open it up here. Questions, comments, random associations?
Well, hi, Niklas here. I'm happy to start if no one else does, but I haven't seen if anybody raised his or her hand. So apologies if I interrupted somebody, but I'll just go ahead anyway. So I was wondering, the act of writing and this kind of this intimate connection you feel in writing, is this always a moment you draw strength from, or is it sometimes also just about like deepening the pain, and that's still okay because there's just this deeper connection. So if you could just talk a little bit more about your feeling while writing and your self-relation while writing, before and afterwards. Now the question is complete.
Yeah, I love writing actually, because I think writing is one of the doorways to wisdom and a doorway to some part of us that has, that has answers or has an understanding, but doesn't really know how to articulate through the strategic mind. So what I mean by that is, if I try consciously to craft a poem, when I've worked consciously at crafting poems, I often find that it's a struggle that moves me sometimes out of the heart and out of this generative field. And maybe this is a blessing or a gift. I'm pretty fortunate in that I don't do a lot of revision on my poetry. I write things, I do a lot of free writing. And when I free write, my free writing is not fast. Some people free write like they just keep their hand moving on the page. Sometimes I'll just write a line and then I drop back into myself and just sit there for a while and then come back out and write a second line. And sometimes those two lines may not even seem like they're related. And then I write another line, and then another line. Then suddenly I realize, oh, that was the connection that some part of me knew. My conscious mind didn't know it, but some other part of me knew there was a connection. So I've gotten to the point where I trust that more. Now, when two lines come that don't seem to fit together, sometimes it's like, oh, then I become really curious. Then I become really intrigued, like, where is my mind taking this? And I love it when I challenge myself. Sometimes I'll do this in my writing. I'll write something that's leading up to a need to have a next line. It might be something like, I went on a walk and I sat by a leaf and the leaf started speaking to me and said. And now I've set up this situation where I have to have the leaf say something. And when I get to that point, I don't know what the leaf is going to say. And I love then just being there. And I'll notice when I'm trying to consciously craft it, like mine is, oh, the leaf is saying, maybe it's saying something like, oh, drink in the sun. Well, that's kind of nice, but maybe that's too conscious. Maybe I need to listen more deeply. What is that leaf really trying to say? Is that leaf curious about me? Am I curious about that leaf? What's our relationship? And I start to go into this world of connecting with it. So that's a lot of how I do my writing. I think, Nicholas, you also mentioned something about struggling or the things that are hard or difficult. I think writing is the best way, one of the best ways to process the challenging and difficult things. To open the door, to have a dialogue with your pain. I've had polio when I was young. I've had some physical problems in my life, and I've written quite a bit of dialogue with my body that has actually produced some incredible stories where I'm learning from my pain. And so I think for me, one of the most useful ways of writing is to engage with something by either taking it in as if it's inside of you, or imagining you become it and you're expressing from that place. So for me, it's about that kind of intimacy with the world, with life, with myself. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Looks like Gay had her hand up.
I do, and I just wanted to say, Nick, how I love, and I loved seeing your hypnotherapy face in the creation of Inner Sanctuary. It is one of the most fundamental processes that we learn and then we teach our clients or our students. And it is the ultimate refuge, and it is the place to address painful issues, I think, because then you can create all the protections that you need there. And I just love that you started out with that. I just wanted to acknowledge you for that. And I love to see that hypnotherapist aspect so prominently and so right at the start. And I'm loving the book. It really is just wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank
You know,
you.
I mentioned in the beginning the whole relationship to our unconscious, and a lot of my career has been about our relationship with our unconscious. So when I first got introduced to NLP in 1978 and to the work of Milton Erickson, I fell in love with the work of Milton Erickson, who was a psychologist, psychiatrist who used hypnotherapy and basically single-handedly sort of reestablished the respect for hypnotherapy in the field of psychology. And Erickson was also known for his incredible use of language. He was very attentive to the words that he used. There are a couple of books that Ernest Rossi wrote with Milton Erickson, where he was basically interviewing Erickson, and he would take a transcript of Erickson working with a client and ask Erickson about every line that Erickson said in that transcript. And the amazing thing is, Erickson could tell you why he said certain words at certain times and how that word was connected to something that either would come up later on or how it would lead to something. He was very attentive to the impact of words.
Well, and he had all that time when he had polio.
Exactly.
And could do nothing but really observe and think. And so, you know, when you talk about wisdom being a result of reflection, boy, that was quintessentially Erickson. My Voice Will Go With You is one of my favorite books ever.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book.
I love that book.
Yeah.
So, well, it's just wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I think that language training with hypnotherapy and my love of poetry all came together with this merging of the two over time. Other questions or comments? There's one other poem that I'll share here in closing, and let me go back to my book just a second. In the introductory section of the book, I just misplaced it for a minute. In the introductory section to the book, I wrote a poem called, or I included a poem called I Can Only Imagine. And it really is kind of an introduction to the book in that it's about what it's like to come back, say, from our own inner journey, because we're all constantly going on inner journeys. That's what reflection is really about. We can do it in a little short few seconds of time. You know, something happens, somebody says something, we do a little reflection, we come back. And we can do it in a bigger way. Sometimes I think there are things we're reflecting on for our entire lives. You know, maybe there's a kind of question that we're continually revisiting. And for me, this coming back is when we go on this inner journey, like take a book like this particular book, you could use this as going off on a journey, and then it's what do you bring back from that? So over the years, as I was exploring my own relationship with my unconscious, going on these adventures, guided by death from that original story I told you about working with the death, with the Crisis Center, and then going off to explore my own imaginal landscape. It's what do I bring back from that and bring back to the world? So this one poem is called I Can Only Imagine. I can only imagine what my stolen eyes would see without artificial light, or how wide a net my heart would cast for safety. But what mostly bends my knee is the extreme improbability of it all. So I welcome the night as an open ear for prayer. I have two, one for the blessing of protection and another for the blessing of fortune. I've already painted my walls with answers while fasting in the desert of solitude. I've already unlearned a catalog of old ways. I've already transferred my shadow crafts and shape-shifting skills into a worldly presence. Now, the whispered voice tells me to follow a greater calling than my own salvation. Upon returning, I never expected a red carpet or flowers to blossom under my feet. only to live in the heartland of my own undiscovered country. And now to invite you to yours. Upon returning, I never expected a red carpet or flowers to blossom under my feet, only to live in the heartland of my own undiscovered country. And now to invite you to yours. And for me, the subtitle of this book is How to Live in Your Own Heartland. And I think that's really what we're here to do on the planet, is we're here to find what is our gift, what is our heart yearning for us to give to the world, and what is our heart yearning for us to bring forth, and to find a way to do that that's not only a beautiful expression of ourselves, but also supports the world in becoming a better place. And if this book could serve the purpose to help people find that in themselves and bring more of that to the world, then I think I've done an amazing thing. And I hope that can actually happen for you. So we're coming close to the end of our time here. I want to say thank you all for joining, from coming from afar and close. And I do hope that you'll join me on the rest of the series. So I'll be doing 3 more of these. We'll go over the other quadrants. I'll do some reading of those individual poems. So if you can put that on your calendar, I'd love to see you at the next one. Please invite your friends and fellow travelers on the journey to join us as well. And Larry, thank you so much again for both your friendship, your support over the years, and for being my guide and interviewer here.
Well, you're so welcome, Nick. It's always an honor and a pleasure. I appreciate everything that you do, and happy to support you in bringing this magnificent artistry and wisdom to the world. So thank you.
And thanks to all of you for joining in. Happy to see you. For those of you far over across on another continent, you'll probably soon be retiring to bed, so may you have pleasant dreams. And for those of you on this side, may you go forth into your day with grace and dignity. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And I will see you in the next iteration, as they say.
Cheers.
Lovely. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Eva. Thanks, Jill. Jill, hi, by the way, before you run off. I haven't said hello to you. Hi, Jill. Sharon, I think she just disappeared. I didn't know if I got a chance to say hi to you too. Niklas, thanks for coming. Diane, thanks for coming. Eva, thanks for being here. Big hug.
Oh, big hug. Love you so much. You're just amazing. Thank you so much.
Cheryl,
really
thank you.
beautiful.
Yep, hug to you. Lee.
That was great. Awesome. It was Nick, my friend Nick from.
So I will see you all in the future.